His Excellency, the Director General of the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa has the floor.
Thank you very much. It's my privilege to coordinate this session, this last but not least session, which is dedicated to the subject of the role of donors and private sector in achieving financial inclusion to women and contributing to the 2030 agenda. So I'm delighted to have with me for this session a brilliant panel, including the following persons. So, Mr. Larena, the head of Impact Division at Symbiotics, Mrs. Paloma, the head of division at OECD, Mrs. Kumamatu, director of the division for prosperity at UNITAR, Monsieur Pascal Delille of European Union. So welcome to everybody. As you know, and as mentioned by Alex a few minutes ago, the achievement of the SDGs require around 2.5 trillion a year. That's a big amount which cannot be afforded by countries alone. Therefore, there is a need to mobilize all the international community, not only MDBs, DFIs, but also the private sector. And according to international data, most of resources today are owned by pension funds, other institutional investors, and of course, private sector. So how to bring this on board to be part of the momentum for achieving SDGs, especially with regard to financial inclusion for women. So this will be the main topics we will discuss today. And I would be pleased to hand the floor to the head of Latin American division at the Swiss Development Agency, Monsieur Gruninger.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to this panel. It's really exciting to be exchanging on this very important topic. And I see we have many colleagues on the panel with a lot of insights, so I'm going to be very brief. Maybe in my first statement, just remind ourselves that we have heard so many important and good statements today about financial inclusion, about women's economic empowerment. And now asking ourselves, what is the role of international cooperation in this? I think it's just worth at the start to remind ourselves that this is part of the larger agenda that we are working for. It's part of the SDGs of the Agenda 2030. And that before getting right into the financial inclusion agenda, just it's good to take a look to the broader gender engagement of the international community. I think we have had an engagement for many decades now as a Swiss cooperation agency, and we have made some evaluations a couple of years back, and it's really interesting to look at one's own engagement as one of all these players that we have seen today. The international cooperation is one player. You mentioned the private sector, which is much bigger volume-wise. And of course, one agency is also just a little piece of a puzzle. But looking at our interventions, we have tried to see which ones are really directed at women, which ones are taking very much into account gender, and which ones are not really dealing with gender issues. And actually, we have very few operations in our agency directly directed at gender issues. It's only 5%. And about 60% take into account in a very relevant manner gender, and still 35% do not. So it was a critical self-reflection we had 2 years ago, and I think based on that we want to improve. And maybe later on I could also talk a little bit about measurement and about more technical but very important things when we talk about women's economic empowerment. Just maybe to mention that with regard to this, we did have a push on especially 3 important topics around the gender inclusion agenda for the Agenda 2030. One is the Women's Economic Empowerment Agenda, which is extremely important and where we have made a lot of efforts. And we have been engaged in different kinds of public-private partnerships, such as the Swiss Capacity Building Facility and other initiatives around financial inclusion and education. A second topic has been the sexual and gender-based violence, especially since Swiss cooperation is quite engaged in fragile and conflict countries, and where this is a very critical issue. And the third would be the women's political participation. Let's not forget that economic empowerment always is part also of political participation. This just to give you a very broad overview of some aspects that we think are very critical and important from a donor, from an international cooperation point of view. And I would really be curious to hear what my colleagues have to say on the panel.
Given your experience in the Millennium Development Goal Fund and later in the SDG Fund and currently in OECD, according to your experience, what positive impact can donors play when supporting projects directed to women's empowerment, particularly in regard with regard to financial inclusion?
And I think that, well, from the SDG Fund, I can share a lot of examples where we are trying just to work with women, but I'm going just to focus on this idea of the positive impact of the donors in the work promoting empowerment for women, especially in the financing side. So the first question is, what's the meaning of positive impact? Are we talking about effectiveness of the aid? Are we talking about to improve the life of women in specific areas? Are we talking about specific groups of women? Because we are talking here about a gender approach. And of course, the situation for all women are completely different than for young women. People living or women living in rural areas are in a completely different situation than women in urban areas, women with some disabilities. I mean, I think that we are talking about gender and women in a very general way. But you know, regarding the impact of the work of the donors. So as you know, now working in the OECD, we have the secretariat of all the subsidiary bodies of the DAC, the Development Assistance Committee, and one of them is GenderNet, that it has just the last meeting last week, where we review the situation of all donors and the impact of the work that they are doing in the field. So the data, to be honest, I mean, the data is not very positive in the sense that even if there is an increase, I invite you really to go to the details of the data in the webpage of GenderNet. But even if the general approach is positive in the sense that we have an increase in the investment of resources for specific women projects in the field, but at the same time, the SDG 5 is the third least financed SDG out of the 17 goals that we have in the agenda. So as you know, in the OECD, we are using the so-called gender marker in order really to have a specific indicator and to see which are the specific projects that are being implemented to improve the situation of women in the field. So you can have a score 0, 1, or 2, depending that you don't have any kind of target related to gender. You can work in different SDGs and with some mainstreaming gender approach or with some impact on gender, but not as a principal goal, but as a significant goal, let's say. And then the score number 2, which means that the program is just focused on gender approach. So out of all the 35 donors that we have now as members of the DAC, of the Committee for Development Assistance, only 3 donors are investing in gender-specific programs as the main goal in the strategies at the national level, meaning that still there are a lot of work to do there. Because then you have a lot of donors, 8 at least, that are saying that the main priority for the strategies on development is focus on gender issues. But even if you have these 8 countries, you have only 8 countries working on gender as really the priority for the strategy on development. So I think that these data are not very positive in the sense that overall we can say that only 4% of the investment in development is focused on gender programs, which is nothing compared with the total amount of investment that we have for other sectors. So I think that, it's a completely different case, probably in the case of conflict and fragile states, where the investment is really, bigger than this one. And in general terms, we can say that the investment on gender in fragile countries is more or less 40% of the total amount for fragile and conflict states, which is really, something compared with the others. And I think that when we talk about the donors, I think that it's also important not just to put the focus only in the government side, which is an important one, but keeping in mind that the new agenda is just talking in universal terms, and meaning that all the actors need to be engaged. In the DAC also, we did kind of a research about what's going on with multilateral organizations and also with philanthropy. So in the case of philanthropy, taking into account, of course, the number of foundations that are reporting using the gender marker, only 16% of the total budget is just focused on specific programs for gender to promote equality and women's empowerment. And in the case of the multilaterals, we are still now in the process to see what's going on, thinking in the case of the multilaterals about the investment that they are using from the core side. Not from the voluntary contributions, of course, but just from the core work from the core budget of the organizations. And then the last question that also I wanted to underline here is that when we talk about women's empowerment and gender equality, I think that the goal is really to improve the life of women in the field. Meaning that I think that it's important to keep in mind that the data is not positive, but we have experiences of really, lessons learned in specific projects. I'm thinking, for instance, in one of the last projects that we received there from Panama, where in a specific area where indigenous people and mainly indigenous women living in the area don't have any access to the land or to all the resources there, the program really developed first the distribution of the land among all the population living there, and then the women's groups really lead the whole process for the recognition of the right to the land. Then they created the cooperative to ensure the access to water, and then now they are managing the resources that they receive for this use of the water facilities. What I'm trying to say is that even the challenges are really very big, but at the same time, I think that also we need to keep in mind the positive things that also we are seeing. So, because, you know, I don't think that it's fair to use this sometimes like a little bit victimist approach, talking about the situation of women. Of course, we need to improve the situation, but at the same time, I think that it's also important to underline that we have, from the donor side, examples of good practices in the field.
No, Mr. Mariano Larena, you are an experienced banker. You have more than 30 years experience. You have been working in banks in Spain and in Germany. You have also been in charge of ProCredit for Latin America. So given your experience in banking and financial sector, what type of incentive will bring the private sector, will bring private investors to engage in social business and to contribute to SDGs through financial inclusion for women?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I'm totally shaken that I'm the only representative of private sector here. So hello. Secondly, we are a special crowd, what you are seeing here today. I'm representing a company which is firmly convinced that we need to be way more active in the private sector of development finance. So you are speaking to a convinced crowd in this regard. I guess that the question is more addressed to those mainstream investors. What we would need to convince, what is, by the way, the big money, what is needed to convince them to invest more towards SDGs in the end of the day. Well, for those of you with some years, you will hear about the free economics books. So you need to have in life positive incentive and negative incentives. So I will describe some of them so that might be moving mainstream investors to go to our sphere of activity, to the impact investing industry. If you have a look at the money situation in the developed countries like Switzerland, you see that the money kind of looks like it needs to flow out of the country because we have a saturated market. The yield is not only low, but even negative. So there is really need of find other investment opportunities with more high capital demands related, so they get more or a decent return for the money. So the need is there. You have a look at the population in Europe, negative growth, or if not more extreme, like negative. We have negative economic growth as well, a negative interest rate, significant, although savings rates and pension contributions, which need to be placed elsewhere. Surely not the focus as it used to be years ago in Switzerland, for example, but outside Switzerland, the country where hosted us. If you have, at the same time, a look at the low and middle income countries, then you have a quite different picture. Then you have a growing population over the time. The economy is also in high need, not only of investing and bank markets. You need also transfer of technology, transfer of knowledge. So it's really quite the opposite picture you are offering. We as Symbiotics, we consider ourselves as a market access platform which allows investors to invest in impact investing, so that's our line. We think that we need to make that quite evident to mainstream investors that there is an opportunity there. The moment you talk about more than 20 years positive and stable track record, if you invest in microfinance or in impact investing, it shows that solid investment you could do there. If we focus in Switzerland, I have here the data that in the last 4 years, only in Switzerland, the assets invested in impact just double the figure. It's increasing. If you go and you target, as we are doing, to convince pension funds, insurance groups, global banks, big asset managers, the other challenge is to convince them, listen, here is a good investment opportunity. Here's a positive incentive for you. You will have a good opportunity of investing your money in a meaningful way. So that's the incentive I was mentioning. Only just out of that consideration, it is worth to have a look at impact investing. And we are there trying to convince mainstream investors.
Mrs. Komamoto, so you are a double hat. You are director of prosperity at UNITAR, but also you are handling the Orishima office. So now you are taking care of the prosperity division of UNITAR. So can you tell us what UNITAR is doing what policies and program does UNITAR launch it to support financial inclusion of women?
For UNITA, as everyone knows, we specialize in capacity development education, so that's what we do every day throughout the year. For any policies and programs we design and implement, UNITA pays close attention to one of the key principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to leave no one behind. And of course, to do that, we have to take into consideration gender equality and the empowerment of women. Now, very specifically, what does UNITA do to promote financial inclusion and the gender equality and the empowerment of women? I would like to share with you a couple of examples. The first example is that I am very pleased to tell you that we are joining forces with ACT Fund, and we are launching a training program of financial inclusion and microfinance. My colleague Alex previously presented the online platform. And based on this online platform, we are launching a number of online training courses, including web-based facilitated dialogue to share knowledge. And also we are organizing a training of trainer component so that this knowledge can be shared to many people in many countries in the Middle East and African countries, particularly sub-Saharan African countries. And the second example is that we partnered with Badea in the past to undertake training program on private sector development. And of course, for this training program, we paid close attention to leaving no one behind, including young people and women. And the final example is that we have been designing and implementing a number of training programs on social entrepreneurship, particularly for so-called fragile states, countries that are in conflict or countries emerging out of conflict. So these countries include Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and South Sudan. And for these training programs, we paid close attention to gender equality and the empowerment of women, including young professionals as well. So that's what we have been doing, just a couple of examples. And I would like to share with you, through designing and implementing these training programs, we have learned a number of lessons. And here I would like to share 3 key lessons we have learned so far. And I also have to agree with my colleagues, although we are making great stride in this field, there is so much more to be done. The first key lesson learned is that this financial inclusion, empowerment of women has attracted lots of attention at the global level. However, when you actually go to the field, talk with local people, still understanding is not high yet. Therefore, it is still important, essential to help people deepen understanding of the significance and the importance of the empowerment of women. In doing this, as one of our colleagues mentioned previously, it is effective to identify male champions, work with them closely, and join forces, and work together. That's often very effective. And the second key lesson learned is that when we talk about financial inclusion, empowerment of women, it needs to be a comprehensive, holistic approach. It has to be cradle-to-grave approach. What I mean by this is that for UNITA, when we design a project, this gender aspect needs to be incorporated from the design phase and also selection of participants, development of materials, and also monitoring and evaluation. It needs to be engendered throughout project formulation and implementation, monitoring and evaluation stages. And the final key lesson I would like to share with you is that when we talk about empowerment of women, there are various approaches. One approach is to design and implement a training program specifically primarily targeting at empowerment of women. This is one approach. However, as we repeatedly said, this gender, it's a cross-cutting approach. Therefore, whatever project, whatever thematic area we deal with, it is essential, critical to take into consideration this gender aspect. So mainstreaming gender aspect into various thematic areas, that's crucial. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monsieur Pascal Delisle. After a rich experience both in academia and in diplomacy, you are now heading the section of economic development, environment, and digital affairs at the EU representation to the UN. So can you just give us some examples of initiatives launched by EU to increase women financial inclusion?
Thank you very much, Sidi, and my appreciation to the organizers of this event for the opportunity to share our experience as EU. Maybe the first thing I would like to say as to what the EU does is that we act as in international cooperation based on a blueprint which is publicly available, which is called the Consensus on Development. It's how we envision international cooperation in the age of SDG. And in this blueprint, gender is both mainstreamed, as we just heard by our colleague from UNITA, and at the same time, we have specific projects on gender. So that's a little bit the framework under which we operate. And if I want to answer your questions in the framework of today's discussion on financial inclusion, I think what we are trying to do by mobilizing private sector and by empowering women is to do two things at the same time, is to address two bottlenecks. The first one, it has been commented before this morning and even here now, we have a lot of private money ready to be invested that needs to find the right conditions to be invested. So we've got a bottleneck in terms of reaching SDG 2.5 trillion. So we need to mobilize private money. And we need to mobilize this private money to the benefit of many stakeholders, and especially in the case of today's discussion, the most vulnerable, the ones considered as high-risk final borrowers, women in this case. So this is kind of the way we approach this dual challenge, these two intertwined bottlenecks for reaching sustainable development. And this link between finance and women is not anecdotal. If you look at some recent studies by IMF, IMF studies estimate that closing the gender gap could boost GDP in countries like Canada or Japan by 4%. It could increase GDP in Pakistan by 30%, in Niger by 32%. So it's not anecdotal. The link between the two is extremely important. And when women are socially and legally able to play a leading role in the economy, access to funding, we know, is very limited. And IFC study in the context of SMEs shows that finance gap for female entrepreneurs in developing countries is almost $1.5 trillion. So how do we do as EU to act on this diagnosis? We do two things. First, I would say it's a general policy that addresses all kinds of stakeholders, and of course, with most impact on the most vulnerable ones, which is de-risking. A lot of this private money will invest only if the conditions are right. It means, for instance, to provide first loss equity, to provide guarantees on loans, special interest rates. So it's basically de-risking to unlock the potential of private investment, and so leveraging private money with public money. We need the two to work together. And the second category of actions are some specifically targeting women. And I say that, adding that, as it was mentioned in the reference of OECD, every project funded by the European Union is screened for its gender impact under the DAC criteria. So this is, in a nutshell, what we do. I could continue with a lot of specific examples, but I don't know if we have time for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me come back to Mrs. Paloma. So, how can donors enhance the awareness of women empowerment to achieve SDGs?
Well, thank you so much. I think that if I have the recipe for awareness, I mean, we can just finish now the panel and go to the street to celebrate in a very big party all the achievements. So unfortunately, I don't have the recipe because especially there is no universal recipe to fix the situation. But I would like just to underline here 3 things. The first one is the message that better situation for women means better societies. So I think that this is an important message because we are not talking about a problem for women, with women, and by women. We are talking about the lack of equality, which is probably one of the most important social problems that we can find in a society. So better situation for women means better societies. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have the data. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to go to the details, but we have the data which confirms that women are more responsible when they are managing loans and microcredits. This is a fact. So I'm not saying that they are the only leads for that, but this is a fact that we have after checking what's the impact of the implementation and management of loans and microcredits by women, especially in Latin American countries and in African countries. So I think that this is a second point to do awareness. And then the third point is that with all the programs that we are trying to promote to ensure women's empowerment, the idea is aid effectiveness. I mean, we're talking here about donors, where we need to engage not only the governments, but also the private sector, as it was mentioned, not seeing the private sector only as a donor, but also as an actor, which means that all the companies can integrate the SDG 5 into the core business of the companies, and also in the case of investors, that I think that, I mean, you really, I mean, put the finger in the right place. So is the private sector, is also government, is parliaments, is also the academia, is the donors and the beneficiaries. So what I'm trying to say is that effectiveness is not a theoretical approach. Effectiveness, it was approved as the main goal for development in Paris Declaration in 2005, and the declaration is still alive. And the declaration was not just like a list to Santa about all the things that we would like to have in Christmas. It was really mainly a specific list of goals and indicators that all the donors need to achieve, which means national ownership. We would like really to promote women's empowerment, taking into account the national settings. and not imposing anything against the setting where we are working. So the first thing is the national ownership, and to ensure that the countries have specific needs and priorities, and that they want to work on that as one of the priorities. And if this is not the case, maybe we need to work on education and to promote diplomatic relations with the countries in order to improve the situation. But the reality is that the national ownership is probably the first requirement for effectiveness. Second is alignment. There is no possibility to implement programs for women's empowerment without taking into account the situation in each country and the formal procedures in each country that are completely different. And we are not talking about a universal system. The third is the harmonization. I think that it was mentioned, I think, in the previous panel, talking about this idea to simplify a little bit the procedures, to share information, to facilitate the process in order to ensure this women empowerment, using the tools that the country already has. But it's also the fourth principle, managing for results. We need to work at taking into account impact. I think, I'm sorry if I'm going to be a little bit clear, let's say, but I think that the setting is feasible to do so. I think that, technical assistance is a very important thing. But with the technical assistance, you don't fix the life of the people. So you need technical assistance because you need to promote, of course, capacity building, you need to strengthen the institutions in the field, but only with technical assistance you cannot improve the life of the people. So I think that when we talk about managing for results, what we are trying to say is that we need to put the focus in impact, meaning improve the life of the people in the field and improve the life of women and girls that are living in specific situations where they need a special reinforcement and support. So, I think that part of the challenge is to take into account the specific needs for women and girls in every case. So, and I remember, and I'm sorry for this bracket, but I remember in the Security Council in the UN, when we were discussing this famous resolution about children and armed conflict, that it was from the political point of view very sensitive. And the idea was to try to avoid the children soldiers, of course, the recruitment of girls and boys for that, which is very unfortunate. But I remember that when we discussed the whole process to ensure the access to schools for the kids, nobody wanted to add a specific mention for girls. And what happened is that after the conflict, normally girls are the responsibles for the houses and also for the agricultural work, meaning that they don't have any possibility to go to school, meaning that they need specific programs in order to ensure this access to schools and to facilitate the empower of girls and women in this setting. So what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about managing for results, we need to keep in mind the situation in each country and in each area, in each geographical area, which is completely different. And then the last principle is mutual accountability. I think that the Agenda 2030 reinforced really this idea, because it's not the traditional way that the donors are going to give the money to the beneficiaries and the beneficiaries are going to do whatever the donors are going to decide about that. It's not the case. We are talking about mutual accountability. And what I wanted just to say, if I may just, because I'm using too much time, is just to say that in the OECD, through the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which was a specific tool created really to have all the stakeholders working for effectiveness, precisely, like 2 months ago, we launched the last monitoring round where we have all the information about these indicators on effectiveness, not only for the donors, but also for the beneficiaries. So we have 160 countries reporting to the Global Partnership about how they are implementing this mutual accountability when they use the resources from donors in specific settings with beneficiaries. So, you know, this whole picture, I'm sorry because I take too long, but I think that it's important to mention that effectiveness is not a theoretical approach. In the case of gender, we are doing, at least in the DAC and also in GenderNet, a special effort to ensure that effectiveness is really a tangible thing that we can really measure and make some decisions and suggestions for the donors related to that.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Kumamoto, you have already shed the light on the role of your organization in terms of financial inclusion. Now, can you tell us more about women empowerment from UNITAR's perspective?
For UNITAR and other many of UN agencies, we are part of this system called UN SWAP, which means United Nations System-Wide Action Plan for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. It's pretty long, but majority of UN agencies are now part of this initiative. What this initiative does is, on an annual basis, UN agencies have to report on progress towards gender equality and the empowerment of women. Basically, what we do is there are 17 indicators, and we have to develop a report informing progress towards these 17 indicators. Now, what do these 7 indicators cover? It's very holistic, comprehensive. Some indicators are covering what kind of strategy, policy, and programs each UN agency is implementing in terms of gender equality, empowerment of women. Some are regarding audit and evaluation system. Some are regarding gender architecture, what kind of leadership do you have, et cetera, et cetera. So it's, again, holistic, and it looks at how organization is promoting gender internally, as well as what kind of assistance these agencies are providing on this critical topic externally. So it's both internal and external aspects. Now, looking at UNITA, we are making good progress. But of course, everything has a lot of space for improvement. So that's where UNITA stands as well. And here, I would like to specifically point out 3 elements. Now, one of the areas where UNITA is doing very well is that at the programmatic level, UNITA is making very well for mainstreaming gender aspect into various training programs. We have so-called targeted training programs for the empowerment of women, but at the same time, we have various thematic training programs that incorporate gender aspect. So great progress in this area. And also the second element is that, as our OECD colleague mentioned, UNITA also has this specific tool called gender marker. So what we do is we give ranking 0, 1, 2. 2 is for projects that have primary objective to promote the empowerment of women. 1 is if this project has some activities to promote the empowerment of women, and 0 is no activities, no specific target for the empowerment of women. So with this gender marker, we are now capable of tracking how much financial allocations we are putting aside for this important topic. So that's one. Having said that, despite all these positive aspects, there are multiple areas where we can make progress as well. And one of these areas is in terms of formulating and putting in place indicators to evaluate the impact of gender equality and the empowerment of women. There have been some indicators in place. For example, when we train people, we we check the number and we say, okay, how many participants are male and how many are women? So this is a very straightforward one way to measure. However, what we are trying to do is to go 1 mile extra and try to identify what kind of impact we are creating through various activities. And this one is still, we still need to make lots of progress, and we are forming partnership with other UN agencies, including UN Women, to be able to do this. So let me stop here. Thank you very much.
So what types of initiative you can suggest to promote private and donors investment in the SDGs, and particularly with regard to women empowerment and financial inclusion?
Perhaps it will be very helpful. We are in Switzerland. We are proud to be a Swiss company, despite I come from Spain, but I mean, this is really a company we all love to work for because it has the purpose we always wish to work for instead of working for a commercial bank, where I used to be active. But going back to your question, this week you have this International Bridge Week, as Reto perfectly knows, where, let's say, social public sector meets private sector in terms of development finance, impact investing, and the like. So what we did to our really good friends of the public sector some days ago, the public actors, private actors, we published kind of an open letter to them, and we propose to take some actions which will really very well fit into what you say. Please remember that Switzerland, in terms of the impact investing industry, is assets under management is 1/3 worldwide. 1/3 is not minor. And if you go more specifically into microfinance funds, it's 40% of the whole industry. So we are talking about overall 9 billion, 9.2 billion US dollars totally. I mean, it's a lot. So that means we here are kind of nicely developed, but we think we could do even better and more. We propose to have action in 3 different, let's say, ways. First of all, let's talk about investor needs and expectations. So, as I mentioned before, we are a platform. We try to convince mainstream investors to go into our space, to attract them, to make them test the waters of impact investing. It's not so easy. But for that, we think we need to review the current framework. Again, I'm talking about Switzerland. This is more or less perhaps equivalent in other countries in Europe. But here, we suggest to the public partners that we have a review of the framework conditions. We should compare the best practices of the peer countries around and have there a dialogue on how we take out barriers to access impact investing. So we go into a policy dialogue, really we go beyond that. Sorry. Hello? Yeah. Then we think that the side target of this step should be to put in equal footing development finance with mainstream investments. That's the target. Of course, this is a quite generic approach, but we need to get started by something. And if there's something I learned living here in Switzerland, you guys, you are capable of doing that. So it's a nice, let's say, culture of consensus. Well, that should be doable. Second step, also related to Switzerland. Remember, here we have really 1/3 of the whole industry worldwide. So we think that we should be able to develop a strong development finance diplomacy strategy. We should create Switzerland as, let's say, as a leader marketplace for SDG finance. That's the target. And we need to be over-ambitious, yes, because if you don't do that, you cannot do what is possible. So that is what we are addressing to the Swiss government. And we know they are hearing, they are very much willing to go into this discussion. And third measure, we think we need to talk about more capacity building, expertise, trying to put investments into creating more of that. We should perhaps talk about align the official development assistance, SECO, SDG, align them to leverage more private capital. I think there is room for improvement there. We should talk about the famous PPPs, public-private partnerships, but we need to make them really move. We need those just to really convince private investors to come. What you said was interesting because it's really important that the public sector is there to mitigate risk, to try to leverage that. That works, that really works. It's just you need to incentivize that way more. That is also a thing we need to discuss here in Switzerland more. We need to catalyze the expertise out there and try to do, again, this innovation and mobilization towards SDG funding. We need really to go there. For example, one thing we could do is try to put in the training curricula for development finance professionals to put this thematic as well. That it will be a small step, but a big one as well, with big impact. And then, well, what I liked, one of the previous sessions before, digital financial services, digitalizing our world, has perhaps a negative touch sometimes, but there's a great potential to leverage things. We also urge to use those means at reach.
Now, can you just elaborate more on what you mean by the role of development assistance institution in the area of de-risking?
I think it's what we need, and when we see 2.5 trillion shortfall for SDG, and when you see that ODA is more or less 150 billion worldwide, EU and its member states is half of that, you understand that you need to grow the resources from the different societies and reach out to the private sector. So that's what we call blending. And for instance, what we have, what we call the EU External Investment Plan, which is one of our kind of latest approaches to international cooperation with different windows, agriculture, sustainable energy, etc., and different categories of action. If I just take one, the one on investment, we have this guarantee that we are developing with 400 million euros of guarantees that we consider, we hope, will have a leverage for a total investment of almost 4 billion euros, mostly with the most vulnerable SMEs. It's specifically on SMEs. So that's a key, it's a clear example of how we can best use the limited public money to really harness the strengths of the private sector and allow and manage the risk, mitigate the risk to allow people at the end of the chain to benefit and to get empowered.
I'm really excited about different inputs that we got from the panel because they all somehow fit together. As Switzerland, as government of Switzerland, we of course share all the different agendas. We have the discussion on the instruments, on de-risking, on blending finance. We have been, and actually are co-chairing the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation. And very much what Mihoko also said about leaving no one behind is very much at the heart of also we're looking for. And Marianne, what you said, of course, about bridging. I want to build on these different elements with some very short examples, because what I think is really about what we can provide is somehow help the whole community that is here in the room and beyond of speaking the same language. because we speak very different languages. I have maybe the privilege of somehow being able to talk to different kinds of persons, so I understand a little bit of aid effectiveness, I understand a little bit of blended finance. In the Swiss Capacity Building Facility, we have the privilege of working with financial pros, so it's really an interesting mix of things, and I think what we can contribute maybe now from the government side is just some inputs, and then other inputs can come from other sides on how to look at these things. And I really want to build on what Paloma, you said at the beginning, and at the end also, we want to improve the life of women in the field. And you were asking, okay, what does that really mean? And I just want to remember that we have been working a long time, of course, with the OECD DAC and with other colleagues, but also very specifically on enterprise development. Together with the donor committee on the enterprise development, we have worked a lot about how to measure impact and what does it mean. And I think what we can bring to the table when we have microfinance institutions from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, is a way of looking at things just to understand how governments go towards programs, because in the end it's the programs that will make a difference. And let me just remind you that we think in results chains. How do we get from what we do to real effects? And it's actually not from the bottom up, but the other way around. How do we get to the woman and the women in the field? And there has been a lot of thought given to it, and maybe we can share it also later on. I was interested to hear what you were saying about the development in that field. But let's be very concrete. It's about additional income. It's about more income for women in their households. And if you go a little bit further, it's about decisions that are made in the household. Who makes the decisions on the resources in the household, how they're being used? And it's about time of people to dedicate to their productive activities. It's about access of people, of women, to resources that they can use for their economic activities. And it's about perceptions of the self. How do I perceive myself as a woman or as a person in my household, in my economic setting, in order to to improve my life? So these were just 5 indicators I now mentioned that I think is really important, that of all the talk and all the different plannings that we are doing, we get down to these kinds of concrete observation fields. Have we improved income? Are really the women making decisions in the household? And if we get to that, I think we have maybe contributed somehow to programs that are being developed, to blended finance instruments that are being developed, and to all different bridges that we hopefully can build together to improve financial inclusion. That would be my contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I noticed that the audience has been following with great interest the various interventions of the panelists. And maybe, okay, please.
I think that we are talking about 2 things. One thing is the use of the resources, where, of course, we need to improve the dialogue among all the actors, not only governments, but also, I mean, as I mentioned before, private sector, academia, parliaments, civil society organizations, and so on. And I think that congratulations, because Switzerland really, with the new revamp of the global partnership with Thomas Gass leading that, is doing an incredible job there. But one thing is the use of the resources in order to help really women to improve the situation. And the second thing is the cultural relations when we are talking about the distribution of the income at the field level. And I think that what I really expect from all the institutions is to ensure freedom for each woman. And it means that women is going to make the decision according really with the individual preferences, and I mean, she will be able to make decisions. So I think that we need to keep in mind the two things, the distribution of the resources and then the cultural setting where we are talking about the idea to ensure freedom, because there is no one model to be women or to live equality. There are many possibilities, and this is the point mainly related to this idea of the national ownership that I think that we need to improve. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sidi, for an excellent job moderating this panel and leading this discussion so far. I am your rapporteur because time is constrained, as we just heard. So if I may, let me share that the takeaway that we have from session number 1 is that there have been some achievements in the issue of financial inclusion for women and the empowerment of women. We have seen what the ACT Fund and other multilateral agencies have been doing, but I want to call your attention to one thing, because it is, after all, the 8th ACT Fund Development Forum. I want to call your attention to the 4.5 million beneficiaries of this organization. It was discussed in session 1 why 4.5 billion is still not enough. We need to have a higher impact. We need to have a higher geographical scope in this type of endeavor. Now, there were also highlights on the barriers to the progress of financial inclusion for women, particularly because of institutional forces hindering them. To note 2 examples, gender gaps are extremely prominent, especially in developing countries. This extends to women because of divorce, because they are single mothers, and because they are heads of family, sometimes at the same time working outside the home. These vulnerable populations cannot obtain financial support because of their socioeconomic roles and because of lack of financial literacy. In addition, globally, there are high numbers of women who do not have documentations, are refugees or IDPs, internally displaced persons, or in other similar circumstances, which means that they cannot access the financial services and support that their male counterparts normally can. Here, at the end of session 1, we also understood something that goes beyond the financial system analysis proper, and it's the fact that financial inclusion and gender empowerment goes beyond these instruments, beyond this analysis, to an understanding that the culture sometimes also hinders women, even when there are opportunities for financial inclusion and financial empowerment. The role of a society in welcoming and empowering women will remain important no matter how much we advance from an economic perspective. In session 2, we were privileged to hear that the winners, 2 of the winners of the ACT Fund Prize, actually came to share the very practical view that they have on why they are supporting sustainable development and the empowerment of women. These have given us the ability to understand how is it that a woman's life can be transformed, and from the vantage point of particularly developing countries. We would like to congratulate again Ms. Aisha Al-Shubayali, who explained how her project trained more than 500 women and girls between the ages of 18 and 60. We also heard from Ms. Nawal Mustafa of her project, the Children of Female Prisoners Association, which was developed as the only NGO working with female prisoners and their children in Egypt. These examples ensure that human development and human rights are indeed guaranteed, or at least for this minority of people that they have touched, but an important number indeed, that they have access to that. During the session, we also heard from Dr. Mary Hodges about the Helen Clark Foundation and how the HKF is providing support towards the prevention of blindness and malnutrition, having a foundation that is almost entirely comprised of women. This is a great representation, a great example of how a foundation, how an entity proper, a development entity, should work, and how they actually make a difference, the HKF, how they make a difference for reducing inequality for females. Finally, our colleague Fiorina Mugioni shared her experience of many years in the UN on working to close the gender gap in financing specifically. She reminded us that there is 1.7 million women exposed to a gender gap in terms of access to finance, and that implies a 6% of GDP. That is an eye-opener, because the minute that you understand the magnitude of the problem and at the same time the magnitude of the potential, then we understand why this issue is indeed urgent. In session number 3, promoting women financial inclusion through digitances. We were reminded that women's inclusion in the usage of financial instruments is broadly recognized as a key driver of women participation in the economy and household well-being, leading to more robust economic growth and social development, as well as more diversified financial systems. Remittances are a high-volume driver for women's financial inclusion, especially when accessed through digital channels. This session explored how access to remittances and other financial services can be improved through digital solutions. Let me repeat a number. 1.7 billion people lacking access, the vast majority of them women, as we say, lacking access to financial services. But two-thirds of them, two-thirds of these 1.7 billion people do have a smartphone. A smartphone is the bridge, the access, the door to financial inclusion, could be. So we were also reminded that women also have a smartphone, a cell phone, and that is an instrument that can be leveraged for our goals. Then Mr. Numane Fehis of Biolabs shared with us how an incubation platform aims to anchor the entrepreneurial practice in his country and to foster a sustainable startup ecosystem. Then Minister Fehji also explained to us that even though there is a gap between people making decisions and youth making a difference, thank you, Excellency, it is important to remember that they interact. They are part of our society. They are our neighbors, our brothers and sisters. He focused on youth, and I want to call your attention to that, because we have debated today. This has been a very, very unique dialogue of experts, a dialogue of people, practitioners, people that actually are on the field, and we have covered a spectrum that is really vast. But there are some things that really jump when you think about it. Youth, the necessity, the imperative necessity to focus on youth, and especially on young women, on empowering young women with these instruments and this effort for financial inclusion. So Minister Fehji reminded us that youth, and especially female youth, remain at the center of the need and the focus of our needed support. Besides government and administration,
we apologize, but the interpreters have now stopped.
Involved, as we all understand, to invest in youth, because again, that generation has less of a digital barrier. Youth indeed know how to use this better than us, perhaps, and indeed they can understand that this is a gate for financial services. In this session, we were also glad to hear that there are several instruments and platforms making great progress in the Sub-Saharan Africa and in the North Africa region, and that we are all part of this effort. Particularly Ms. Sabine Mensah elaborated on the power of information to start with data, because she said that with no data, no measure, no progress. Indeed, that was an excellent call of attention. She also said that we need to make sure that the regulatory environment indeed opens the digital economy and it's welcoming to all citizens in a country. A starting point that she mentioned is that we should open digital payment infrastructure to everyone, to make it available and affordable, and the emphasis is in the word affordable. Beyond finance, digital technology can empower women in other sectors. Digital technology can indeed be a channel for a global improvement of human development. And last but not least, in session 3, we heard from Dr. Buhari, who focused on how we can use digital forums to empower women. Digitalization is indeed advancing the world, but 60% of people lack access to the internet. Civil society, working hand in hand with government, with international organizations, can help bridge that gap, and especially focus again in this digital divide on empowering women and within the universe of women on young women. The digitalization is a tool, not an end, but it's a priority, must remain like that. What we need to do is to expand the knowledge, services, access, and opportunities starting at a young age, because everyone knows that now teenagers become instructors in use of digital technology, especially to my generation. And finally, we had excellent comments by Ms. Olga Speckhardt on how to transfer knowledge and experience to replicate good practices in other countries, but because Ms. Olga Speckhardt will be giving us closing remarks, I don't want to steal her thunder. She will come and she will share her views on this day. Before I go, I want to thank you for allowing UNITAR to be part of this effort. I want to thank you for your stamina, impressive, 9 to 5. Lunch included. You really deserve a round of applause, but I also want to call your attention to this. This is the official United Nations magazine here in Geneva. We have another one in New York, and this forum will be covering this magazine in the next edition. So if you wish to contribute an article, to contribute some comments for the article that, as the editor-in-chief, I will have the privilege of leading, you will be most welcome. And with that, please help me in welcoming Ms. Olga Speckhardt for the closing remarks.
It is up to us to live to the legacy that was left for us, and to leave a legacy that is worthy of our children and of future generations. We are witnessing a legacy that was set up by His Royal Highness, Prince Talal, that is impacting the lives of future generations. Your Excellency, Mr. Nasser Al-Khatani, Mr. Alex Mejia, distinguished guests, experts, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to provide with the closing remarks of this productive summit. I wish to start by conveying again my sincere gratitude to ACFund and UNITAR for hosting us. Empowering women through financial inclusion has highlighted important aspects for each and every of us. The launch of the UNITAR Global Training Platform on Financial Inclusion will promote holistic, sustainable, responsible, and impactful outlook on financial literacy. We invite you to use this impactful tool straight ahead. We must continue to collaborate and work together to come up with solutions that will address the global challenges. Poverty, climate change, health, food security, among other challenges, requires all of us to work together. The solution is us. This can only be achieved through partnerships. One of our partnerships example is our collaboration with ACFund, UNITAR, the SCBF, SDC, and BDEA in the upcoming years. So we are most proud to be part of it. I wish to conclude with a quote by Kofi Annan. There is no tool for development more effective than empowerment of women. This conference has truly lived to this quote. Thank you very much.
With those remarks, I really wish you the best ahead. We will adjourn, but with the invitation that you join us for the informal cocktail reception as soon as you go outside of this beautiful room to the right. So please enjoy. Thank you for coming. Have a good night.